Hey everyone, Dr. Bill Ahearn joins me in session 299 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I've met Bill a few times over the years at conferences, and I'm so glad we finally had a chance to sit down and record a podcast together. Bill is the Director of Research at the New England Center for Children, and longtime listeners may recall that NECC sponsored a series of episodes. And in this podcast, we talk about some of the great research that has come out of this storied institution. As an aside, if you want to learn more about NECC, particularly working there, you can find more information over at NECC, that's necc.org/jobs. We covered a lot of ground in this conversation. I'm going to list off just some of the things we talked about. We talked about Bill's early experiences as a grad student and clinician, his early work in addressing feeding problems, the research that he and his colleagues have conducted at NECC, how he construes stereotypic and self-injurious behavior as being forms of repetitive behavior, what he's learned about addressing stereotypy, including when and when not to intervene. We talk at length about response interruption and redirection, particularly when it is and isn't necessary as an intervention. If you have questions or concerns about RIRD, this is the podcast for you. We talk about the behavioral interpretation of anxiety and interventions that Bill and his team have brought to bear on related repertoires. I ask a few lighter questions or lighthearted questions on some other topics of mutual interest. You'll have to listen towards the end to hear that. And last but not least, if you listen to nothing else from this podcast, towards the end of the show, Bill talks about why he's proud to be a behavior analyst. Please listen to that segment, as I think he makes some excellent points that are worth sharing. This podcast is brought to you by Frontera. Check out Frontera's assessment builder and see how the ethical application of AI technologies can help you serve clients and save you time. Your first assessment report is free, and if you use code BOP25, you'll get an additional 5 assessments for just $100. So head to fronterahealth.com to check it out. I had a conversation with the folks from Frontera the other day, and a lot of agencies and organizations are heading over to Frontera and are learning more and more about what they do and are engaging them in their services. So glad to see that the word's getting out. We're also brought to you by CEUs from yours truly. Yes, that's true. Behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs. Learn from your favorite podcast guests while you're commuting, walking the dog, or whatever else you do while listening to the podcast. I've added a bunch of new events, and there are discounts for volume purchases. So to learn more, again, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs. We're also brought to you by the Behavioral Toolbox. Check out our courses for school-based and other behavioral professionals, including our newest one, Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-In. As an aside, I also gave a workshop the other day with just a great group of behavior analysts in Maine at their state conference on the course that's over at the Behavioral Toolbox called When Not to FBA. It went over really well, so if you want to get the digital version of that course, again, go to thebehavioraltoolbox.com and click on the tab. There's a tab at the very top of the site that says Courses That Improve Behavior. We're also brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn more about their CEU offerings, RPT courses, supervision courses, live webinars, and lots more over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. That's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get to this fun conversation with Dr. Bill Ahearn.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sicoria.
Dr. Bill Ahearn, it's good to see you again. And I should say we've had a number of conversations in person, but it's long overdue for you to come on the podcast and talk. Usually we're talking about things like craft beer and jam bands and things like that. So I'm not sure if we've ever discussed anything behavior analytic. So let's change that. Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Matt. I appreciate that.
In trying to think about what I wanted to talk to you about, there's so many directions to go, and you've had a long career, and you've done a lot of research in very different areas. And so it was kind of like a grab bag of different topics. So I was a little challenged to try to figure out where to start. But I guess what we will start out though, is like we do with all the guests here on the Behavioral Observations podcast. For those who aren't familiar with you or your work, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself? I'm more curious about, how you first discovered behavior analysis, what the scene was like at that point in time in the field, and, kind of walk us up from some of your earlier experience and bring us up to what you're doing these days at the New England Center.
Sure. I always like to hear people's aha moments relative to behavior analysis.
It's fun, right?
It is. Those stories are oftentimes compelling. More often than not these days, the aha comes from my advisees who have had some personal connection with autism through a sibling or another family member, or had volunteered in some capacity working with autistic people and found behavior analysis. But my pathway was very different. As undergraduate at the University of Miami, I was really interested in evolutionary biology. And the more I studied biology, the more I realized that there was a lot of chemistry involved, and I really didn't like chemistry that much. But I was interested in behavior and animal behavior primarily. And at one point, I transferred out of biology as a major and sort of fumbled around in a couple of different areas. I was an English literature major, and 100% will admit that that was so that I could take a specific class by a professor who was teaching in Old English, and part of the readings were Lord of the Rings. So we had this sort of setup whereby if you were a psych major, generally you could take all of the classes that you needed to get your degree in about a year and a half, 2 years, if you had all of your other requirements there. So I eventually transferred over into the psychology department, and the introduction to psychology class that I took, the first one, was taught by a professor who was Pavlovianly oriented, Daniel Cruz. And I was really, interested in what he was talking about in terms of reflexes and behavior. And so I went up to him after the first class that I was in, and I said, "Hey, that was really some interesting stuff. Let me tell you a little bit about why I think it's pretty cool." And I told him that I was interested in evolutionary biology. And he said, "Hang on, I've got a paper for you." And I went back to his lab, and he gave me Skinner's selection by consequences. And so that was really my aha moment. I read Skinner's selection by consequences, and I knew that what I was interested in learning more about was behavior and learning and how it took place. And I started volunteering in the animal lab that he was working in. He was essentially doing what I think we would refer to primarily as preference assessment work with pigeons. It involves schedules of reinforcement, but the schedules of reinforcement were aligned with different seed types. So these little tiny seeds like poppy seeds were not as preferred generally as big seeds like corn. And so how much more would they work to get the corn as opposed to the they're called rape seeds. And that really sort of opened up pathway for me to take a look at what happens in those choice situations. And so as I was getting towards the end of my third year and figuring out what I was going to do, down in Florida, you're pretty much working in the tourism industry or construction. And I knew I was not going to do either of those things. So I started to think about, well, what could I do to further my interests in learning about behavior and learning? And I decided I was going to go to graduate school. I applied to a bunch of places. Dr. Cruz had suggested that I apply to Temple University, partly because he thought that it would be good for me to continue on in the sort of Pavlovian tradition of his lab, and he wanted me to work with Phil Bursch at Temple. Phil was working primarily on learned helplessness influenced work with rats. His daughter's still an active researcher, I believe, Lauren Alloy, and does learned helplessness work to this day. But I went and I was picked up at the airport by Phil Heinlein instead of Phil Bersch. And Phil started to talk to me about what my background was. I will be honest, I didn't understand half of what Phil was saying most of the time because, his understanding of the English language is up here and the rest of the world is kind of like over here.
Were there any show
and
tunes sung? That's what I want to know.
not at that time.
Okay.
Although I've been around for some of those show tune singings.
That's an if you
but
know,
Phil
you
has
know.
quite the voice.
Yes, I've seen it. Yeah.
And so I ended up asking Heinlein to be my advisor, and that worked out pretty well for me. At Temple, I was doing a lot of work on choice between diminishing returns, not too dissimilar to what I had been doing. And the really, I think, somewhat accidental pathway to applied behavior analysis happened through regular meetings that we had at Temple, the Delaware Valley Association for Behavior Analysis, where a lot of the guests that were invited were applied behavior analysts working in the Philadelphia area. That's how I first got to know Saul Axelrod. And the one thing that I really took away from that is there's some exciting work going on in applied behavior analysis. I started reading more widely. I read every article published in JABA one summer. That's not as impressive as it sounds because I'm pretty old. There weren't that many articles in Java then, and I was really intrigued by what was going on. And when I got to the end of my doctoral studies, I decided that I was going to go get a little bit of applied experience, thinking that that would put me in a better position to be a funded researcher. I assumed that I'd be going into academia. I was really, to some extent, trained by Phil to be a teacher. He developed the inner teach technique, and I'm a big proponent of that for certain types of classes. And I was lucky enough to get accepted for a postdoctoral fellowship at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, where Wayne Fisher and Kathleen Piazza and Louis Agopian and a number of other folks were. And that I was there for maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks when I just thought to myself, wow, I'm never going to leave this field. It was just too much more reinforcing than what I had been doing. Do I want to wait 4 years for a bunch of old behavior analysts who are pretty cranky to finish arguing with each other so that they could then tell me what I need to do to publish my manuscript in JAB after I sacrifice that pigeon at Skinner's grave? Or I could be working with clients who have challenging behavior and we're making progress on a daily basis. The reinforcers were very different. And like everybody else, the more immediate reinforcers for me were compelling. And when I finished the postdoc, there was an opportunity to go back to Philadelphia. I was interested in going back there. I enjoyed living in Philadelphia. That's not everybody's cup of tea. Neither is Baltimore. In fact, being in Philadelphia, I thought I was prepared for any city, and then I went to Baltimore. But the one thing that was an opportunity for me that provided a lot of clinical oversight and training that one really needs early in their career was I had an opportunity to manage an inpatient unit at the Children's Seashore House doing pediatric feeding work. And that was quite an experience. What I really enjoyed about it was that I got to interact with a number of different disciplines. The speech and language pathologists and occupational therapists that had dysphagia expertise were fantastic colleagues. I learned so much from them. And the pediatric gastroenterologist that we worked with was just a really fantastic clinician. So a lot of the kids that we were working with on the inpatient unit were total food refusers, the vast majority of them. And typically they had a good reason to not want to eat. medical issues early in life of many different kinds. And once they were medically managed, it was then our turn. Oftentimes, those cases were relatively straightforward. You always started out with some type of differential reinforcement, and that was enough for most kids. However, those that we ended up needing to go to more intrusive interventions, not too many people are super excited about using any form of escape prevention, but it's necessary in some cases. So as I became more aware of how these procedures worked, and they were very effective, but there were generally two variations. One is some form of a physical prompt at the jaw. Some interesting work has been done over the years to teach us how to do that in a way that minimizes the intrusiveness of the intervention. And the other was what I ultimately referred to as non-removal of the spoon. I was not so, enthralled with some of the euphemisms that people used for that particular procedure, like contingency contacting. What contingency are you contacting other than or preventing escape? So a lot of what seemed to be happening is the clinical team was attempting to guess what the parents wanted us to do relative to these types of interventions. And I was much more oriented towards, I'd rather know if one worked better than the other. That's important information that we should be sharing with parents. If they both work, well, then it would be a good thing for us to describe the procedures, show them the procedures, and have them choose which one they would like to use. So sort of put together my first major applied research effort in comparing physical guidance and non-removal of the spoon in this setting. And it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot of things from that, not just as applied researcher, but as a clinician. One of the things that we put together in this protocol is we're going to show the parents both interventions at the very beginning and both interventions after we had achieved our goal, which was at least 80% independent acceptance, accepting a bite of food within 5 seconds of the opportunity being provided. And then the parents would choose. With all three of the kids in that study, the physical guidance procedure and the non-removal of the spoon procedure was effective. And from a clinical perspective, I would have chosen the non-removal of the spoon because it's less intrusive, doesn't involve hands on the child. All three of the parents chose the physical guidance procedure. So that taught me an important lesson. Sometimes what might be the best thing to do is not always what the parents are going to choose. As I got into, say, my second, going into my third year, I decided I was really not super excited about being in a hospital environment. The contingencies were such that we're being pushed to get the kids out as quickly as possible. It's very expensive, so I understand why. But it seemed like we were occasionally compromising what would have been the best clinical pathway for the patients we were working with. And I was also thinking that here's an opportunity for me to now capitalize on this experience and move somewhere that will likely be home for a long time. We were planning on having a child, and my wife's sisters, three of her sisters lived in Massachusetts. Our parents lived in Florida at the time. So we were thinking, we're going to go to Florida, we're going to go to Massachusetts. And I started asking around what would be good places to work. And the New England Center for Children was something that was mentioned to me by folks working in the severe behavior unit there at the Seashore House. I learned about Gina Green, and I also learned that Murray Sidman was working at the New England Center 1 day a week as his retirement job. And the opportunity to interact with other behavior analysts was very appealing to me, especially such prominent folks as Gene and Murray. And so I was offered a job at the New England Center in 1996, and I took it, and I've been here since then. I came in as a program specialist. That's equivalent to what you would expect a relatively independent BCBA to have as a clinical caseload. Did that for 2 years, became a program director. And my second year as program director, Gina left the New England Center, and I was given the opportunity to be the director of research, and here I am.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. It's funny when you said I asked around about programs. I think it's worth pausing on that for a moment to remind listeners of where the field was in 1996. That year stands out for me also because that's the year I graduated from college and then went on to graduate school. And at the time, I know the New England Center had a kind of like a come work for us and you can get your master's degree while you're at it. And that was something that was in consideration. I didn't end up doing that. I went elsewhere. But as an undergraduate looking for graduate opportunities in behavior analysis, it was a profoundly different scene at the time. So I was wondering if you can just maybe do some sort of description, maybe historical compare contrast. Because I know we have new people entering the field all the time, as you know. And I think it's worth reminding folks how far the field has come in such a short period of time.
Well, first off, if you would have told me in 1988 that I'd be working as an applied behavior analyst, I'd say, what the hell is that?
What is that? Exactly.
And it certainly was the case. And, to some extent is to this day that behavior analysis was not really an accepted paradigm in psychology. That really didn't deter us true believers. The Kool-Aid was sweet and we drank it together. But the opportunities for working in applied behavior analysis were starting to emerge. Lovas's work became fairly well known. The book by Catherine Maurice, Let Me Hear Your Voice, came out. The demand for applied behavior analytic services for autism treatment started to gather momentum, but it was a very small set of people that were qualified to do that kind of work at that point in time. And my perspective now is that it's hard to have imagined how quickly the field would grow and how much support we would be getting from society at large to do what we do. I know there's an awful lot of resistance to applied behavior analysis for a variety of reasons, but the demand for our services is undeniable. There are a little over 4,000 licensees in Massachusetts, and there were over 6,000 job ads last year.
Wow.
So, from the perspective of where we were to where we are now, if you're a BCBA and you have a hard time finding a job, then you probably live in Montana, just about everywhere else. And by the way, there's, I'm sure, good jobs in Montana. In fact, one of the students who is in my third year cohort, my theoretical foundations class this year, is from Montana. And she plans on going back. I believe she said there are like 9 BCBAs in Montana. There might be a few more than that, if I recall correctly. But, it's a very different landscape now than it was back in those days. So going to an institution of excellence like the, Kennedy Krieger Institute, or when I think just specifically towards feeding and treating severe challenging behavior, the group in Iowa was prominent. Of course, they're the strongholds in in Kansas and Michigan and in Florida, but there really was not the sort of widespread opportunity that there is now.
Yeah, I think people of a certain age will remember there was this little thin green book for graduate opportunities in behavior analysis, and it was like a pamphlet, you know. And another funny thing, I'm preparing for a talk that I'm giving next week that for the Babbitt Social, and one of the things I was looking at was a paper published by Bridget Taylor, Linda LeBlanc, and Melissa Nozick, and yeah, it was published in 2018, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, we've grown." I'm paraphrasing the abstract, but there was like, they didn't say, "Oh my gosh," but there was some, there was language, I think, in the abstract saying the field is growing so much. We've got 30,000 BCBAs now, and it's like we've got like almost 80,000 now in the span of just 5 or 6 years since the publication of that paper. So it's just nuts. So
meaningful change in schools starts with true buy-in from teachers and leaders. But resistance is real. Overloaded with initiatives, educators often feel unheard and overwhelmed. Our online course, Motivational Interviewing, Getting Educator Buy-in, empowers you to create genuine collaboration, learn to build trust, align with their values, and inspire lasting commitment, not just compliance. Ready to transform engagement? Enroll now at thebehavioraltoolbox.com.
I'd like to get into your work at NECC, and I think the first time I saw you speak was about 10 years ago at APBA, or maybe longer than that, because I think it was the first one. It was in Boston. And I think both you and Dr. McDonald also gave, there was like a video modeling plus stereotypy. It was like the NECC festival, maybe there was maybe this, some work on prompting thrown in there too, some of the things that I think you guys are pretty well known for. So anyway, and again, to my earlier point, you've been involved in a lot of different strands of research. So can you tell us just with respect to your work at NECC, the types of different things, types of problems that you guys treat, and some of the lines of research that have come out of that?
So when I first came in 1996, one of the things that was really interesting about being in this environment, being in a school where you have, a residential component, you have access to the students 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. There's an awful lot of things that you can target that are going to help the individual out in terms of their life skills. A lot of the individuals that we had severe challenging behavior, but there was a really wide presentation when I first started. There were some kids that were pretty high functioning. A lot of our students that entered at a very early age in either home-based programming or in our preschool that Becky managed. Becky's retired, although I don't ever want to let her go. We still meet with her pretty regularly on some of our work. So that perspective is one that really focused people here at the New England Center on what are all of the skills in the lifespan that are necessary, starting with those really core skills and expanding that out. When I think about how that's expanded over time, the need for good, solid work with severe self-injurious behavior in particular was pretty obvious what the pathway to that was by then. The New England Center had Richard Fox as a consultant, which was very helpful. We also eventually brought in Brian Iwata to help consult. In fact, I was the one that suggested to Vinnie Strelly that it would be a good thing to bring Brian out so that we could take this culture that we have here and really embed that mindset of the functional analysis, the functional intervention approach and what we do on a day-to-day basis. There are many different ways that one can come at severe challenging behavior, but that was important. I spent an awful lot of time working with some of the severe cases that weren't on my caseload just because I had some experience in that area at the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And as we sort of moved from this infancy in using that technology to becoming experts in that, we became more and more effective in dealing with challenging behavior. And there were some sort of episodes along the way that steered us in a direction. So you mentioned work on stereotypy. Let me tell you sort of a couple of stories about how that came to be. When I became a program director, we would have these meetings about different initiatives that we would like to have school-wide throughout our services. And one of them early on was working with the students that we had, and we also had school on Saturdays, by the way. That meant that we had to have administrators take turns going on, and Kathy Foster, who was the second in command, I can't remember what title we used back then, but probably assistant executive director, had been the administrator of the day. And we had a program directors meeting the next week, and she was very invested in making sure that she was aware of what's going on everywhere. And that's one of the things that we benefited from, is by having our administrators being everywhere and visible. And she suggested that a lot of the students were not as actively engaged as we might want them to be. Was it something about Saturday school? We have a lot of students that are in groups. Is there something that we can do to make it less likely that they're going to be on their own, more often than not engaged in stereotypic behavior, but rather when teacher's working with another student, what can we do to make it more likely that they're going to be engaging in meaningful activities, even if it just is independent leisure skills? Is there something that we could do? So part of what that initiative turned into was an effort to take the picture activity schedule as a way of introducing across the teams and functioning levels and types of leisure activities this approach where we would be working with every student, identify the things that they like to do, things that they had functional skills with, things that they may have liked but didn't engage with functionally, teach them those skills, and then have them independently engage in stuff while the teacher's working with the other student. So that really started me thinking, well, what's going on relative to stereotypy? And I started combing through the literature, started talking to my advisees about this. And one of the things that was very influential was the work that Kathleen Piazza had done in a competing stimulus assessment. There was this cool study that she and her colleagues published on identifying competing activities with pica. And that literature has actually come a really long way and eventually has led us to a very productive way of attempting to address that very serious form of self-injury. But then there was another one that was published with other forms of automatically reinforced behavior in 2000. And I thought, well, here's a methodology that we can use to identify the activities that the individual likes to engage in, and we can use that as a means of populating the way that we're going to attempt to address their downtime. So the very first study that we published on stereotypy was actually inspired by that work, the 98 and 2000 Piazza et al., where they had suggested that matching stimulation, the stimulation seeming to match the types of stimulation being produced by automatically reinforced behavior, were generally those types of activities that were most likely to compete. And that was true. But we had a number of individuals who engaged in stereotypy that if we gave them other activities, that they readily engaged in that were not the same kind of sensory stimulation, that we were actually getting more functional skills going rather than trading one form of repetitive behavior for another form of repetitive behavior. So that perspective and taking a look at the literature, when we think about automatically reinforced behavior, what is it that sort of leaps out at you at that time? For me, automatically reinforced self-injurious behavior, by the way, automatic reinforcement does exist, despite what some people might want to say. It's a crucial concept, and it means an awful lot more than the sensory reinforcers being produced by the class of behavior. But the one thing that I knew very well is that automatically reinforced self-injurious behavior was the most difficult kind of challenging behavior to treat, most of the time, not always. So in terms of why did we choose stereotypy to have a best practices research focus on? Well, part of it was that not much work was out there at the time to help guide us in that direction. A really seminal paper by John Rapp and Tim Vollmer was published in 2005 that suggested the vast majority of instances of stereotypy seemed to be automatically reinforced over 90% of the time. Certainly, that matched up with the results that we were generating, the functional analyses that we were doing. But at the same time, if we learn what to do in terms of the best practices of approaching stereotypic behavior, repetitive behavior, and I'm using the term repetitive behavior because I'm going to go into other forms of repetitive behavior where I think we really need to go ultimately, that automatically reinforced self-injurious behavior is not something that you're going to spend a lot of time experimenting with. You're going to get to treatment right away. It's generally a crisis. Yes, occasionally there are other forms of challenging behavior in the individual's repertoire that are a higher priority, and maybe you're not treating self-injury at the outset. But if we learned what are the best practices for assessing and treating automatically reinforced repetitive behavior that is non-injurious, that's probably going to teach us some important lessons about what to do relative to automatically reinforced self-injurious behavior. So that was part of the inspiration there. As we sort of gathered this series of strategies, we're always focused on appropriate behavior from a clinical perspective. If we are shaping and establishing the skills that are necessary for an individual to, be as independent in society, to be happy, right? We really want to be focusing on what can we teach them that's going to be meaningful. So if stereotypy is something that interferes at times, well, then we may want to encourage them to do something else, perhaps what it is we're attempting to teach them to do during those times in which we're teaching those things. But stereotypy is not self-injury. So it's not something that we're looking to eliminate. If the individual enjoys engaging in stereotypy or it has some functional purpose or outcome for the individual, then we definitely are not interested in eliminating it. In fact, we want to make sure that there's time for it to happen.
Hey there, I know you're enjoying this conversation, but I want to take another quick break here and let you know that Behavior University has some great webinars coming up, and they are on the following topics. There's a webinar on reducing staff injuries in human service settings, AI and ABA, smarter tech, better therapy, and Behavior Analyst burnout, shared responsibility and workplace solutions. So there's just a handful of webinars that are coming up. And, well, you've heard me say this a million times, very likely, but these things sell out. So if you want to get in on these webinars, go to behavioruniversity.com and click on the live webinar tab. And while you're there, shop around a little bit and use the promo code podcast at checkout to save 10% on your order. All right, let's get back to this conversation with Bill. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Bill, because I wanted to get into, because I think there's some confusion out there, or at least I would say that's perhaps maybe too pejorative. But there's a lot of discussion about even the propriety of treating repetitive behavior with automatically reinforced behavior and things like that. Obviously, self-injury, we got to do something about. But the stereotypic piece, I think is something that whether or not these conversations are happening in behavior analysis or in the wider world of people concerned with autism more generally. So I think if there's some direction about the conditions under which one would and would not assess and treat that, I think that would be helpful for the audience to understand. So I'm curious for what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that was part of the objective of this line of research, in fact, is to figure out what are the situations in which we need to go in and do something to have the skills that we're attempting to teach be accessed, be something that becomes part of the individual's repertoire if repetitive behavior is interfering with it. Well, there are times in which that repetitive behavior might be indicative of boredom. Do we have the right sorts of reinforcers in place? It might be something that is occurring because the environment is aversive. And there are a number of lessons that we've learned over the years that have sort of led us to this understanding that not every form of stereotypy is automatically positively reinforced. Some of it is automatically negatively reinforced. Think of ear plugging or ear flapping. We assume that that's because the environment is aversive in terms of the auditory stimulation that's there. What do we do with that information? Well, with automatically positively reinforced behavior, it's a very different situation than automatically negatively reinforced behavior because the individual's in an aversive environment. Our goals are to teach them what they can do to make that environment less aversive. You're wearing headphones now. How many kids with autism are wearing headphones to dampen noise? Well, a lot of them. Why? Because it's a functional coping skill that we attempt to establish. Another thing that I think is really misunderstood about repetitive behavior is that when repetitive behavior is being referred to as something that is performing self-regulation functions for an individual, I'm not endorsing the idea that self-regulation is something that we can define and, easily come to, oh, yes, this is self-regulation. But rather, I oftentimes see stereotypy occurring when there's some aspect of the environment that is aversive, but not as overtly aversive as, say, auditory stimulation. Well, then we should take into consideration what are some of the things that might be problematic. So we started off on looking at repetitive behavior that was primarily stereotypic. Through our initial studies, we developed the response interruption and redirection technique. In the very first publication in 2007, read the discussion section. It tells you that we're not looking to eliminate stereotypy. It also tells you to be careful of the situations in which you use it. It tells you to be mindful of the fact that it's attention. And if this is something that's reinforcing, you may be making repetitive behavior more likely to occur. But nonetheless, as we moved along from that initial study, we then started to focus on appropriate behavior that we were targeting. Well, with vocal stereotypy, what's the alternative that we initially were looking at? Appropriate vocalizations. So our second line of work in that area, Candace Cologne's master's thesis, was focused on verbal operant training. We're attempting to teach certain communication skills in a manner in which the individual's vocal verbal behavior is clarified by an autoclitic frame. So that was the essential component to the teaching. And if we were doing good teaching, do we see, right, the levels of vocal stereotypy not being problematic. Well, sometimes they're not. We saw in that study all 3 of the participants had much lower levels of vocal stereotypy when we were doing this verbal operant training. But we had also enrolled participants that the clinical teams were referring to as their vocal stereotypy seems to be interfering with their skill acquisition in important areas, particularly verbal behavior. And so we were redirecting them to engage in the teaching task. And that study was followed up ultimately with Haley Steinhauser's dissertation, where we're taking this into a classroom environment. What's our goal? Well, we want to have the targets of appropriate behavior for every student to be matched to the needs of that learner. So we crafted 4 different contexts in which we were taking a look at. If we have good prompting procedures, effective reinforcers, and a differential reinforcement intervention as the way that we're attempting to teach those skills that we're targeting, is it necessary to use any form of redirection, or does a well-crafted learning environment do the trick? And for all of the kids that went through that study, at least 50% of the context that we had them in, all we needed was a well-crafted learning environment appropriate to the learner, prompting strategies, and effective reinforcers. We had this one student, this was published in 2021. I think it might have been one of the articles that I sent you, Steinhauser et al. This particular student that didn't make the publication was really interesting. So we did a functional analysis, and we saw about 80% of the time he was engaged in stereotypic behavior. When we brought him into these 4 learning contexts, we saw almost no stereotypy. All we needed was a well-crafted learning environment. Now, we didn't get the opportunity to show that data set in the publication, even though I thought it was the most important of all of the participants. It shows, look, you can have tons of repetitive behavior, but if you have a really, well thought out plan in terms of instruction, there's no need to treat stereotypy. In fact, that was one of the first things that I got from the work that I collaborated on with Becky McDonald. All of this play skills training work that she's done over the years. Drawing attention is really just social interaction within a particular kind of context. But a lot of what we were working on for the young kids that Becky was working with were teaching them play skills, partly because teaching play skills provides opportunities ultimately to learn social behavior in those environments in which most people would be learning social behavior. But if you look closely at that play skills training literature, oftentimes you have at least anecdotal reports that the individual is engaging in repetitive behavior, sometimes the manipulation of objects that are the play materials is repetitive. But once we teach, video modeling, in vivo modeling, matrix training, there really is a change in behavior such that we're now teaching these play skills that are providing reinforcers, and ultimately those are automatic reinforcers that end up maintaining the behavior as well. So in terms of, we don't want to trade one form of repetitive behavior for another form of repetitive behavior, but if we trade it for functional engagement and in a variety of activities, then we're moving that person such that they have their behavior more supported by the reinforcement that's available in the environment. So part of what this idea that we've always had from the beginning when we started this work is that if we're targeting appropriate behavior, most of the time we expect that to be all that we need to do. We understand what are the prompting procedures that are effective for an individual and what are the skills that are appropriate to be teaching them. If we are mindful in doing that, and one of the long traditions of research at the New England Center before I started was in preference and reinforcer assessment. I'm starting with Rick Graff, continuing with Jason Beret. Cam Johnson's done work in this area. Eileen Roscoe's done work in this area. I've done work in this area. Part of what we're really focused on is, let's identify those things that are preferred edibles, preferred activities, preferred social activities, and use that knowledge, right, to attempt to establish the behavior such that it becomes something that's in contact with the intrinsic reinforcers in the environment that are there for those responses. And that's what we want to do. We don't want to be maintaining it with extrinsic reinforcement, but rather we want behavior to be prepared to be supported by the contingencies that exist there in the natural environment.
I want to make sure I understand you correctly on that, because one of the questions I had is about the generality of this to like novel settings, to untrained, caregivers and things like that. To what extent do these findings extend outside of these experimental contexts?
Well, maintenance and generalization is crucial, but from the standpoint of repetitive behavior, right? I'm going to go back to using the term repetitive behavior because it's not just stereotypy. Self-injury is oftentimes repetitive. Some perseverative behavior that maybe we can talk about this in a little while. We sort of hit upon in some work that was being done here at the New England Center that maybe repetitive behaviors at times they're indices of anxiety. But one thing that is important relative to repetitive behavior is that it needs to be taken into context, right? If an individual is engaging in repetitive behavior and they're uncomfortable, they're unhappy, well, then there's something we should be doing to figure out why, so that we can help to establish the appropriate coping skills in those situations. But when it comes to teaching and learning, there are two critical aspects of the teaching and learning that sort of lay into this notion of what's the goal in terms of generalizing these things that we're working on into the natural environment. And the first thing is that they need to have the repertoire to begin with. So we need to figure out how that works and to work on it occurring not just in you were referring to experimental settings, but to some extent, the beauty of working at the New England Center is that most of our experiments are informed by questions that are occurring on the floor with the kids that we're working with. But once we establish the repertoire of behavior, it's then important to move it into other environments. The response interruption and redirection technique, in fact, was inspired by something that I observed when I was meeting with Becky. We're actually working on joint attention study at the time. She got a phone call from Bill Holcomb, I believe, who is now retired as Becky is, and I share a birthday with Bill Holcomb. And so she was talking to him, I think, about one of the kids in the home-based program, and I was just looking out in the hall, and I saw a teacher come out of one of the classrooms, and she had a handful of laminated line drawings. And she runs down the hallway, and she's putting these little line drawings all down the hallway. And then she went back into the classroom, and she came out with the student. And she's walking with the student down the hallway, and she gestures to one of the line drawings like this, right? And the child's attention goes to the thing, and he says something. I can't hear what they're saying or see the line drawings. And so she's doing this as they're going down the hall. And at one point in time, he engaged in vocal stereotypy. And she went like this, asked him a question, he answered, asked him another question, he answered it, asked him another question, he answered it. And then she continued to walk down the hall and gesture at the line drawings. So I knew who she was. I waited till she was done. I had my meeting with Becky, and I went into the classroom and I said, "So what were you doing there?" And she said, "Well, we had just done some discrete trial training with these words that we were working on, and was then doing some incidental training with him on that so that we could generalize what we're working on our discrete trial task out into," I'm kind of paraphrasing, "into a different environment." So the targets that we have to be meaningful targets for the individual. And then we need to be thoughtful in terms of taking our teaching and moving it into the natural environment and assuring that we're continuing to maintain it. But I mentioned there are two things that are important here. Okay, so one is taking those things that we teach and then providing the opportunities to engage in them. But then ultimately what we need to be doing is removing or thinning gradually the reinforcers that we've been using in teaching so that we can then use the natural reinforcers that are in the environment, which are primarily social. In fact, one of the things that we did in the joint attention work that I just mentioned that I was meeting with Becky about at the time, we had a little bit of a problem in some of our joint attention work, and that is, how are we going to reinforce these responses that are social in nature and do it in a way that supports it such that the intrinsic consequences are going to ultimately just take over. So we developed this technique for exposing a kid to different social stimuli: high fives, verbal praise, tickles, head rubs. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you do this with adolescents, but these were young kids. And we used an arrangement whereby we were having them tell us which ones they wanted by passing a token over each time, and then comparing that to extinction, passing that to identify social stimuli that serve as reinforcers. In that particular study, the publication itself, the study, was sort of an afterthought. The real purpose was teaching social interaction skills such that we're working on having an interaction between the student who does rarely initiate social interaction bids, but will readily respond to them, such that we're now moving the individual's repertoire from, they'll participate, but will they initiate within the context of these social interactions? And by identifying these social stimuli that served as reinforcers, we were able to become more effective and also program for that generalization for those intrinsic reinforcers to then take over.
I see.
It takes a lot longer with other, learners whose repertoires aren't quite there yet. But ultimately, we should always be looking at what the reinforcers are for the skills that we're attempting to teach in nature, because that's what we want to be maintaining: behavior, not edibles, not tokens, not access to the iPad, but rather the naturalistic consequences for those responses.
As a BCBA working with children, specifically kids with autism, have you struggled to get through your initial assessments? With all the time it takes to do assessments, it's frustrating to not be able to get clients into services. That's where Frontera can help. Frontera is a HIPAA-compliant, AI-powered platform for ABA therapists and BCBAs who work with children with autism. Frontera was founded by Amal Deshpande, a successful entrepreneur and the parent of a child with autism. Frontera's team of clinicians and technologists use evidence-based research, powerful AI, and digital phenotyping at every stage of a child's journey with autism to provide insights and help improve outcomes. What does this mean in practical terms? I'll give you just one example. You can cut down the time it takes to complete initial client assessments from 8 to 10 hours to 3 to 4 hours. This saves time and lets you begin treatment and help your clients sooner rather than later. You can learn more and explore Frontera's easy-to-use assessment builder and diagnosis builder features at fronterahealth.com. Your first assessment report is free, and if you use code BOP25, you'll get an additional 5 assessments for just $100. So head to fronterahealth.com to check it out. I enjoyed that story about how you observed that teacher. That's really interesting. It's always fun to hear how these things, how these things are inspired. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, and I don't mean to overly focus on response interruption and redirection, but if you did, list some of the aspects of the paper of the conditions under which it should and shouldn't be used and the things for people to be concerned about. But I sometimes see a lot of people or some number, just casting response interruption and redirection aside as an intervention kind of wholesale because of concerns they might have about it. What would you say to someone who says, that's a really intrusive intervention? It could cause distress from the caregiver, there's probably a lot of other concerns that are out there about it that I'm not readily tacting right now, but they're out there and I'm sure you've seen them. If someone was apprehensive,
I don't think anyone's seen them as much as I have.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let me focus the question a little bit more tightly. If I'm a parent and I'm like, hey, Dr. Ahearn, I've read all these terrible things about RIRD online. Why are you suggesting that this is an appropriate intervention for my child? Okay, so I'll just cut to the chase right there. What would you say to me, assuming that you felt that was the correct intervention?
Well, I mean, you start with it's the correct intervention. However, I'm reluctant to use response interruption and redirection. I generally would prefer to avoid any type of intervention, period. I don't want to implement a reinforcement contingency if I don't have to. But mostly what I'm interested in when it comes to interfacing with parents who are generally the ones, right, the parents and the clinicians that we work with are the ones saying that this is a response that's interfering with the things that we have as objectives. So I'm cheating a little bit in that I'm reframing your question a little bit because
It's a classic move.
Well, I do want as a default it to, be known that that's not what we're looking to do ever. We're always looking to target appropriate behavior and in the least resourceful, manner possible. But if we're getting to the point where we're considering using redirection of any kind, and I don't care whether it's for self-injurious behavior, whether it's for repetitive behavior, whether it's for something that we think maybe is an indice of anxiety, although we generally try not to use it there. One of the things that going to default to is, well, we're not going to ask the child to do something that they can't already do. We're not going to ask them something that they are generally non-compliant with, but rather we're going to ask them to do things that they readily do. In the 2007 study, we describe how it is that we selected the demands we used in the redirection technique. We went into the IEP records of the students that we were working with, and we identified mastered skills. And then we went back and, will they readily comply with these academic demands that we have for them? A lot of them involve things like answering a question, simple motor responses. And if they readily complied with those, right, with no prompting, since they had already learned them, then those were the only things that we would redirect their behavior with. We wouldn't be asking them to do something that they found aversive. We wouldn't be asking them to do something that they didn't know how to do. In fact, as we sort of went along in this area, what we were able to show, we're doing a study right now where we're comparing more arbitrary forms of redirection versus contextually informed redirection, right back to the task. What we're going to do, if I was talking to a parent, I'm not going to use the term redirection. Say, we're going to encourage your child to do what we're asking them to do and provide reinforcement for that. Whereas if they engage in repetitive behavior, we're going to try to come back to the task. If we need to take a break, we'll take a break. But what our focus here is that we're attempting to learn these things. And to learn these things, sometimes we need to focus on it. So we're going to encourage them to work on this at this point in time. So if we're focusing specifically on teaching them some verbal skill, like in Haley's study, which, the communicative objectives that we selected in that study were all the skills that were at the very high end of the student's repertoire. Those are things that are particularly important for them to be working on. It was very different across each one of the learners. Then we are going to find that this encouraging them to do something else is something that if it's going to work, we're not going to need to do it for that long. And if we need to do it for a long time, well, then maybe we need to consider not doing it at all. And what are some other techniques? Do we need to re-examine the prompting procedures that we're using? Do we need to re-examine the reinforcers that we're using? But part of what I'd be talking to about anybody that has a question about redirection is that redirection has great value. Think about your day-to-day life. If you have a goal to exercise some every day, right? You're redirecting your own behavior in some way, shape, or form such that you're encouraging yourself, to get to the gym or to go for a run or to do whatever it is that is your preferred form of exercise, if such a thing exists for you, right? And it's something that when we think about why would we use redirection, well, redirections in some way, shape, or form operating, we think, as positive punishment. It's not the only possibility, but let's just default to that. If that's the case, well, what's the goal? The goal is to not use positive punishment. The goal is to establish behavior that's meeting reinforcement such that it's the reinforcement that's carrying the day. So regardless of whether we're attempting to target, food refusal, attempting to target automatically reinforced self-injurious behavior, we're targeting whatever it is that we're targeting. It's important for us to be looking down the road because the goal is to not use those procedures at all. Did I answer your question?
I think so. Yeah. I appreciate that because I think, again, there's so much out there on this stuff. And, to your point, you probably hear your fair share of it, maybe more than that. And so
can I go a little bit into a couple of lessons that we've learned along the way?
Please, absolutely.
So there was a study that was done by Nicole Rodriguez when she was a doctoral student here with Rachel Thompson. And she was working with some higher forms of repetitive behavior. Arranging and ordering is the class of term that was used, but it really presents very differently in different kids. For example, one of the students that was in her study would move furniture around and it would create an unsafe environment. And so they did a functional analysis to intervention approach to it. And it was their goal to use competing stimuli. But what we knew about identifying competing stimuli at the time was not what it is that we know now. So they were attempting to identify stimulation that seemed to match what it was that the arranging and ordering was producing in terms of sensory stimulation for the kids. And it didn't work out as well as they would have liked for any of the participants, and they needed to incorporate overtly response blocking for 2 of the 3 participants. And one of the outcomes of that study was, yes, they were able to develop an intervention for them. But one of my doctoral students at the time knew a couple of the participants in that study fairly well. And Kara Moore, she said to me, it just looks to me like they're anxious when they can't move things around in the environment. So that really started us off on a journey. Well, we know that individuals with anxiety are it's population non-specific. Everybody alive has had anxiety. If you haven't had anxiety, then you're a sociopath, I think. But the one thing that is particularly problematic with kids with that don't have good communicative repertoires is we can't really ask them. So if we think they're anxious, what are some ways that we can confirm, yes, this seems to be an index of anxiety for them? Ultimately, we ended up putting together a protocol where we were looking for kids that presented with repetitive behavior that caregivers were reporting to us. It seems like they're anxious when they do these things. So if they're engaging in things like freezing, rocking, perseverative speech, or arranging and ordering, items in the environment. What what does that look like if it's some kind of automatic negative reinforcement? Well, it looks like anxiety. Is it the case that if we signal these things that seem to be aversive events for them, right, and they engage in these repetitive responses during that signal, that's what anxiety is, right? Anxiety is when you engage in emotional behavior in a context where aversive events are upcoming. So the whole goal here was to refocus some of the thinking relative to the repetitive behavior that we saw with these individuals and to come up with a treatment for anxiety that was going to be effective, which was drugs. No, I'm just kidding. Those never work. But rather was doing, a proxy of the kind of thing that we would expect to be done in cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, some form of teaching them coping skills, relaxation. Generally, we, in that study, individualized relaxation routines for each of the participants in the study that did show what looked like indices of anxiety. And it was always repetitive behavior. And once we taught, and it was not something that was easy to teach either. It took a long time for each of the participants that were exposed to this relaxation train. And then expose them to the anxiety-provoking stimuli once they have these coping skills so that we can get them to the point where they're no longer anxious in those situations, right? Some of those situations are the ones that you would expect. A haircut, loud noise, going to the, nurse's office. And in sort of taking this ultimately back to Nicole Rodriguez's really, I think, important study on arranging and ordering, one thing that we learned from the anxiety study is that if it looks like anxiety, well, we're not going to block that response. We're not going to redirect it. We're going to try to teach them coping skills. But that's not always what it looks like with that higher level arranging and ordering. Sometimes it seems to be the final product that they put together. And if that final product is something that's not potentially harmful to them or anybody else, well, do it, right? You like lining up cars, and by shape, color, size, that's fantastic. In fact, that's the kind of play skill that I would assume we would commonly see in neurotypical kids as well. So how is it that we distinguish and come up with better ways of intervening with that arranging and ordering that doesn't seem to be related to anxiety? Was a focus of Riley Fergus, one of my current doctoral students. She's defended her dissertation, and we haven't published this yet. So I'm usually reluctant to talk about things that we haven't published, but I'm pretty confident in our findings because what we used to identify the competing stimuli for the participants in her study was the augmented competing stimulus assessment. And we were successful. 2 of the 4 participants in her dissertation, no response blocking or redirection of any kind was necessary to have good treatment effect, where we were obtaining generally 0 levels of arranging and ordering. And the other 2 participants that we needed to use some form of redirection with, we were able to remove that redirection in the generalization environment because they were now engaging with those competing stimuli, and the automatic reinforcers, we can presume, that come from engaging in those competing stimuli was sufficient for carrying the treatment effect through to the natural environment.
Hey, I just want to jump in here, and I actually do think I say this somewhere in this podcast, but if you want all the references that we mentioned, go to the show notes for this episode. But you can take it one step further. You can go to behavioralobservations.com and hop on the email list, and you'll get the show notes delivered directly to your email inbox. It's that easy. Just go to behavioralobservations.com. There'll be one of those annoying pop-ups that pop up. Put your email address and name in there. I don't sell the email addresses anywhere else. You're not going to get spam. Well, you'll probably get spam, but it won't be coming from me. All you'll get from me are the show notes. You'll get an occasional notification if I put CEUs on sale, but for the most part, it's just the show notes and everything else that you hear in the podcast. And again, it goes right to your email inbox. So it's pretty straightforward. You can check it out from there. over at behavioralobservations.com. One other thing, if you get tired of hearing these commercial breaks and you just want the conversation, no intro, blah, blah, blah from me, no music, no nothing, just the conversation itself, go to patreon.com/behavioral observations and learn how to sign up as a subscriber there. All right, that's it for commercials for this episode. Let's hear the rest of this conversation with Bill. Are there other aspects of working with individuals with anxiety that, I mean, obviously you have a line of research and we can probably talk about this for multiple podcasts, but, so you gave us kind of like at least an overview of the Moore study. And just for folks listening, by the way, there'll be comprehensive show notes for this episode over at behavioralobservations.com. So don't worry about taking notes. I'm going to bug Bill to send me some links to stuff, and I've got a lot of them already. We'll get them there, so don't sweat it. We got you covered. Anyway, where was I going with this? Yeah, so are there other aspects of like just, how you guys construe anxiety and things like that you want to cover, perhaps without getting too far into the weeds, or we can move on to the next thing I want to talk about?
I think one of the things that you mentioned that you wanted to talk about is that behavior analysts maybe have some apprehension relative to talking about or treating anxiety. And there are some good reasons to not treat anxiety. Anxiety is occasionally adaptive. It might lead to escaping in situations where escaping and avoiding is pretty adaptive. So, but if it becomes like life interfering, then the individuals that can seek that treatment on their own, that's great. But those that don't have the communication skills to do so, identifying it and being mindful relative to taking these indices of anxiety into consideration for what you want to do with that individual, I think is very important. There are parallels in what we do in other situations where we maybe just assume that behaviors escape maintained. And oftentimes it's in these situations of social negative reinforcement that anxiety develops. Like if we have kids that don't like to brush their teeth or have a haircut or something like that, we usually use some form of desensitization. Really, desensitization is relaxation training and gradual exposure, right? And it's what we would expect is the frontline intervention when we see phobia, when we see anxiety. And from a behavior analytic perspective, I think part of what we offer as a unique perspective is that we don't treat emotions as things we have that cause behavior, but as predispositions to act. Emotion is something that's more complex. It's not a unitary entity the way that we treat it in our everyday language. I have anxiety. What does that mean? Well, I have a feeling, and this feeling is not so super fantastic. Okay, that respondent aspect of anxiety is usually what leads to somebody seeking treatment, or it interferes with the individual's enjoyment in life, and so that feeling is something that's important, but it's only a predisposition to act, because we then engage in behavior in those situations that meets consequences. And it's those consequences that establish the behavior that we see in those situations. So when we talk about the feeling, the emotion, it's a purely, respondent phenomenon. But then all of this learning takes place with respect to that feeling. And some of it is going to be conditioned responses of the reflexive kind. Some of them are going to be behavior that comes under stimulus control when those stimuli that signal something aversive is about to happen then are engaging in these responses. Is it perseverative speech? Is it crying? Is it negative vocalizations? Is it rocking back and forth? Is it freezing? Is it whatever the responses are, those are things that we can do something about by teaching the individual better behavior to engage in when they encounter those signals. That's why relaxation training of some form is very important and helpful. Now, you're not engaging in psychotherapy. If you're a licensed behavior analyst anywhere, you're most likely prohibited from engaging in any form of psychotherapy. It's usually part of what you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to diagnose, not allowed to engage in psychotherapy. But I think when we conceptualize the emotional behavior that's occurring, behavior is behavior. And we're in a good position to be able to treat it. What I think we don't have generally in the repertoires of most applied behavior analysts is a good understanding of respondent behavior and how that works. Right? We focus appropriately on operant responding because that's the majority of what, we're doing relative to teaching skills, to dealing with presenting challenges. But the feeling part is important. But what then happens from the feeling part is well within our domain of expertise.
A lot of times the conditions of anxiety and depression go hand in hand. Have you guys looked into using this behavioral perspective to treat depression? Or is it something that you guys looked at anxiety just because it's the, some of that kind of aha moment Dr. Moore had, that you described, is that something that you see more of and that's why you directed the research program to that? Or is it?
Well, everything comes back to automatically reinforce self-injurious behavior because there's some forms of self-injury that really seem to be more related to automatic negative reinforcement. Right. And if we have automatic negative reinforcement, then it feels bad when you're engaging in these responses. We need to figure out what feels bad. I think there's been a lot of really important work done attempting to identify physiological variables. Tim Fulmer's done some fantastic work in this area that relate to the presentation of challenging behavior. So we're not a doctor, but we also have a lot of individuals that we work with that can't tell us what the problem is. And so we're on that journey to identify it. So ultimately, our anxiety work has really flipped into, we're attempting to move this in directions where we're targeting those crisis cases that look like anxiety. And so in that work and the resources that we have, our focus has always been to sort of take that which we've learned here and applying it to severe self-injurious behavior. You make a great point about anxiety and depression going hand in hand. We really haven't focused on depression, and it's more so that it's just not been a priority for us yet. When we figure something out, and then we try to then learn how to do it as efficiently as possible, do it in ways that are as effective and efficient. But at the same time, once we get to that point and we're moving along, then we're on to the next thing. I think that, when it comes to the way that we can intervene with anxiety in terms of what we've learned and what many other folks, like I think you mentioned Pat Fryman's work, there's a fine line between anxiety and phobia. Right? We deal with a lot of phobic behavior. And so the things that we've learned pretty directly translate into being effective when the presentation is phobia. When it comes to depression, I think that there's some other aspect of what's transpired for that individual's lived experience that needs to get us to step back and take a look at this situation and bring all invested stakeholders in, because when depression is presenting, we then are looking in areas that may be beyond what we know. Doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of behavior there that we can attempt to come to operationalize and understand and then effectively intervene on. But I think we've got a long way to go to be effective in dealing with depression. And I'm not going to talk about something that Haley wants to talk to me about tomorrow, but there are some presentations of self-injury that look like they might in fact be depression.
Fascinating. I guess we'll just put a to be continued on that one if that develops further. I have held you way, way, way past the time I promised. So I do want to bring this conversation to a close to be respectful of your time, Bill. But I can't, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up your FABA talk from 2023. I'm proud to be a behavior analyst. It was the keynote address to that event. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. I was wondering if you could just give a key idea or two that you were trying to convey to the audience. Obviously, most of the listeners to this podcast won't have been there. But if there's a theme that you want to leave the audience with, I can't think of a better source, if you will. So if you could share some thoughts on that talk, that would be great.
Well, when I think of myself as a person, I think of myself as a behavior analyst first. And I know that that isn't the way that everybody thinks, nor is it necessarily how everybody should think. But I really feel that behavior analysis has been formative for me as a person, not just for, what I've been able to do as a job or what I've been able to do in terms of gains that I've worked with so many clients over the years for, betterment of their condition. But as time sort of has rolled along, being an advocate for applied behavior analysis has been what I see as the most important role that I could possibly serve and that anybody could possibly serve that's as invested in the field as I am. And I have, for a long time, been a little unhappy with some people in our field. Right? And this isn't new. There have been a lot of people that are self-promoters that have branded different things that are being presented as, this is the best way. Let me just talk about positive behavioral supports. Positive behavioral supports in the public schools. What a fantastic development that we can convince school systems that it would be a good idea to have a thoughtful approach to interventions that we might use when challenging situations happen in the schools, and we need to figure out why certain behavior is or is not occurring and what would be the right tier of intervention to start with for that individual. But positive behavioral supports was branded by a lot of people as this is better than applied behavior analysis. In fact, you hear it to today. In Ireland, there are some people, in fact, that suggest ABA should be abandoned. We should use positive behavioral supports. And, I hear that and I'm like, have you ever read anything that the founders of positive behavioral supports have written? They tell you right off that they are applied behavior analysts. And that's how they've come to have this approach in the public schools. So when somebody's getting up and saying this is better, nothing's better than applied behavior analysis. Applied behavior analysis is something that is not a procedure. It's not a set of techniques. It's applying the principles of behavior analysis to produce socially meaningful change in behavior. To do that, it takes an approach that is individualized to each situation that you find yourself encountering clients in. And I've met a lot of applied behavior analysts over the years. 99% of them are some of the most compassionate people that I've ever met. And I've met them long before people started talking about compassionate care. Now, when I think from an ethical standpoint, what is the obligation of an applied behavior analyst? It's to provide a therapeutic environment for their clients, because their clients have a right to that therapeutic environment. And that's something that was put together in a paper published in 1987. It's not something that's new. But what's new is that we've become better and more efficient and needing to rely on less resources over time. I would like everybody to have the focus that as an applied behavior analyst, I'm here for my clients, but I'm also here for the betterment of the field. I'm not here for whatever personal accolades that I can gather. And I shouldn't be going out there and scolding everybody else because they're not doing everything else the way that I think they should be doing it. But maybe what would be a better, more productive approach for us as applied behavior analysts is to be focused on what can we do to be the best applied behavior analyst we can be for our clients and for the field. And that's something that is what I am attempting to get across in that I'm an advocate for applied behavior analysis. Are you? I want people to think about what they're doing and what they're saying. Maybe you should be scolding a little less and supporting a little more. That's what I would like to see.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I told you that was the last question. It was a bit of a white lie. Quick lightning round here. All right. What's your favorite IPA right now?
Oh, it's hard to pick one. Let's see. I think if I have to go with one IPA, I'm going to just be boring and go with Double Dry Hop Congress Street. I really like Galaxy hops.
Okay.
By Trillium Brewing, by the way.
I was going to ask, my original question was Trillium over Treehouse.
My family really likes Trillium better than Treehouse. I like them both. They're both fantastic brewers. But, give me a Double Dry Hop Congress Street over any form of Julius. So those are my two favorite representations. I guess if I was going to stick with Galaxy hops, I'd have to say green, but I think Julius is better than green.
I just visited the one in Tewksbury yesterday and have a stash of Treehouse for myself. Now, if anyone's listening to
it's a beautiful location too.
Yeah. Apologies to those of you who are outside of the greater New England area and have no idea what we're talking about. All right, let me move on to another lightning round question that might have just slightly a bit more general appeal. All right, is Goose a legit jam band or are they Fish wannabes?
That's hilarious. I don't like Goose or Fish.
Oh man, that's the incorrect question.
I'm being a little disingenuous. I can listen to Fish and enjoy it. Their lyrics are a little ridiculous at times. It's really their playing that I enjoy. And as I've heard Trey play on his own, it's like I kind of like listening to Trey even more than Fish. Goose is kind of fun. They're new, but I don't like Fish better than the Dead. You're going to find me listening to Billy Strings. And is that really what I would have ever imagined I'd be listening to? Bluegrass? Psychedelic bluegrass?
A 30-year-old kid from Michigan playing bluegrass. Yeah. All right. So,
by the way, while we're on that, if you do like bluegrass and you've listened to Billy Strings, listen to Molly Tuttle and Golden Highway. Man, she shreds.
All right. What is your favorite Grateful Dead song?
That's
no. Excuse me. Let me rephrase. What is the best Grateful Dead song?
Oh man, the best? That's an impossible question to ask. I would have to go with the 72 China Rider.
I'm sorry, Bill. That's incorrect. The best Grateful Dead song is Help on the Way into Slipknot.
Slippin' Franklin's is an excellent one. Yeah, it's in my top 5. If
everything else is, everything else is
there's a permanent product evidence that I picked Help Slip Franklin's in my top 5.
All right. Well, thanks for playing along with the lightning round. Thanks for letting me hold you way, way, way over the time I promised you. And I will see you next week at the Babbitt Social. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Bill, and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Matt. And thanks everybody out there for listening. Hopefully we didn't bore you too much.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.